The glorious past. Looking back now, it feels like another lifetime. My name is Elizabeth Parker, and I grew up in a small town nestled just outside Seattle. I was the only child of two school teachers whose love for learning shaped me into a determined, curious, and independent woman. College felt almost inevitable, and by the time I graduated with a degree in computer science, the world seemed full of promise. I remember standing on the steps of my alma mater, diploma in hand, believing fiercely in my ability to make a difference. I met David at a tech conference downtown the summer I turned 25. He was sharp, charismatic, driven, always radiating the kind of confidence that could fill a room. What drew me to him, though, was his genuine curiosity. We spent hours huddled in corner cafes, scribbling out ideas for apps, discussing industry trends, even arguing good-naturedly over the best way to solve a stubborn coding problem. It wasn't long before our partnership became more than just professional. By the time I was 30, we'd pooled our modest savings, bought a 2-bedroom starter home, and incorporated Parker Solutions, a software development firm dedicated to helping small and medium-sized businesses modernize the way they worked. I remember the thrill of those days, surviving on ramen and takeout, sketching wireframes on napkins, trading sleep for deadline after deadline. But it wasn't just the excitement of starting a company. It was the sense that David and I were building something that was truly ours. Each late-night pitch, every client meeting, and line of code written became a shared investment in our future. Business was never easy, but it was honest and exhilarating. We landed our first big contract in a stroke of luck and unwavering persistence. David was brilliant at networking, connecting with clients who needed our skills, while I wrangled the technical side, managing a growing team of young programmers, many as hungry as we had once been. There was a camaraderie in the office that I still remember fondly, a belief that, together, we could overcome any obstacle. It wasn't just work, of course. David and I grew our family and our company at the same time. Amidst board meetings and debugging sessions, we took camping trips in the mountains or unwound at neighborhood barbecues with friends who cheered each little victory. There were setbacks, late payments, product launches that weren't as smooth as we'd hoped, but the hardships seemed survivable because we faced them together. The foundation of all this was trust. Ours was a partnership forged in adversity and risk, but tempered by laughter, shared dreams, and respect. I prided myself not only on my technical expertise, but also my ability to nurture relationships, not just with my husband, but with employees and clients who came to see us as more than vendors. Our business became a tight-knit community. Looking back, I see how hard we worked to build that foundation. Every long night and early morning, every leap of faith and moment of compromise shaped the life and legacy we were creating. I believed, with every fiber of my being, that integrity and loyalty would always be at the heart of what we had. That belief would be tested in ways I could never have predicted. But in those early years, I carried only pride, hope, and a persistent sense of possibility. A trusted companion. If my years with David taught me anything about partnership, then my friendship with Michael Turner taught me about trust. Michael entered our lives when Parker Solutions was still in its infancy, at a point where every decision felt make or break. At 34, with his slightly graying hair and dry sense of humor, Michael was the kind of man who seemed calm in any storm, a trait we desperately needed. He had cut his teeth in corporate project management, but his spirit was entrepreneurial at heart. Introduced by a mutual acquaintance, he first came on board to consult on a major contract we nearly fumbled. His steadiness and sharp, practical insight quickly made him indispensable. Before long, he became much more than an advisor. He was our friend, and in a very real sense, a member of our small family. I would often joke that I'd inherited not just a business partner, but a brother. Michael could read a room with uncanny precision, smoothing tensions with a perfectly timed joke or a word of encouragement. When David and I disagreed on hiring strategy or whether to take a leap with a risky client, Michael played the role of mediator, dissecting the pros and cons, then leaving us both feeling heard. He had an instinct for finding compromise without anyone feeling they had lost. Our families became close over endless Friday night dinners, pizza one week, home-cooked chili the next, where we'd unwind, hash out problems, and sometimes debate the finer points of baseball or jazz. His wife and daughters seemed like second cousins to our own children, sharing birthdays, camping trips, even the occasional snowed-in holiday when traveling out of town was impossible. At work, I confided in Michael more times than I can count. He was the one I'd call late at night when a server crashed, or when I worried we'd made a wrong move with a client. I trusted him with the key details of our internal systems, opened up about cash flow worries, and let him in on my hopes for the company's future. In turn, he gave us not only his time and expertise, but also his loyalty. More than once, he took the blame for mistakes that weren't his, simply to preserve morale and unity. I remember in particular the season when David's father fell gravely ill, and David had to spend weeks back and forth between Seattle and Phoenix. I couldn't have kept things afloat without Michael's silent support. He stepped into 1,000 small leadership gaps, never asking for credit. In those long months, it was Michael who reassured worried staff, calmed jittery customers, and kept the company's vision alive, while I juggled business and family on my own. For years, I believed my faith in Michael was unshakable. I opened my playbook to him, client lists, management templates, even the underpinnings of our profit-sharing model. Every secret I had, I entrusted to both my husband and my dearest friend. I took pride in our transparency, felt grateful for the rare privilege of building a company on friendship as much as expertise. Thinking back on those days, I see not only the strength his partnership brought to my life, but the comfort that came from knowing someone had my back, someone I considered a true companion on the long, hard road to success. At the time, I never imagined how fragile such trust could be. The shadow of betrayal. If anyone had told me, during those golden years of camaraderie and shared ambition, that darkness would one day settle over everything we'd built, I wouldn't have believed them. Betrayal, in my mind, was the stuff of tabloid headlines or dramatic films, not something that crept quietly into the lives of ordinary people. But that was before I learned that trust, when misplaced, can be the most devastating weapon of all. When I look back, I can almost pinpoint the day things began to feel off. It was winter, gray, persistent rain drumming against my office window, and the numbers in our quarterly report didn't quite add up. At first, I attributed it to an accounting error, or perhaps a client slow to pay. Nothing unusual for a business of our size. Still, a persistent unease began to worm its way into my thoughts. I remember the day I mentioned it to David. He waved it off with a laugh, saying, "You worry too much, Liz. We'll sort it out." Michael backed him up, promising he'd review the invoices with me after the holidays. But the holidays came and went, and so did that meeting. Looking back, I realize how masterful the distractions were, how smoothly my concerns were redirected or buried under the avalanche of project timelines and staff issues. I had always prided myself on my instincts, but in those months, I let my faith in my partners cloud my judgment. We'd built the company together, after all. We'd survived bankrupt clients and server meltdowns, late nights, and unpaid bills. Why would I suspect, even for a moment, that the two people closest to me could ever become my adversaries? Signs accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly. Bank statements missing from files, client emails that mysteriously never arrived in my inbox, slight changes in Michael's tone, David's sudden reluctance to discuss long-term planning. Sometimes I would catch them in hushed conversation that fell silent when I entered the room. I chalked it up to stress or fatigue. Everyone was burning the candle at both ends. It all unraveled one chilly Thursday morning, nearly a year after that first odd accounting glitch. I arrived at the office to find a formal notice on my desk. The letterhead was our own, but the words were cold, legalistic, a suspension pending investigation into financial misconduct. Effective immediately. I felt the world tilt beneath me as I read the accusations. Siphoning company funds into a personal account, forging client signatures, breaching fiduciary duty. The pain was like a physical blow. These weren't just business allegations. They were attacks on my character, my livelihood, my name. I rushed into David's office, the paper shaking in my hands, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself speak. He was waiting, already rehearsed, face cold, voice distant. Michael stood beside him, ashen and stiff, arms crossed in front of his chest, refusing to meet my eyes. The words were a blur. "We have evidence, Liz. Please, don't make this harder." I remember my pleas, pleading for an explanation, begging for the truth. Each word bounced off them like stones thrown against a wall. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. I was put on mandatory leave, my passwords and accounts locked. If there had been confusion or mistake, I told myself, surely it would resolve itself. But it only grew worse. Whispers swept through the office about how the boss lady had been cooking the books, about greed and hubris, and the fall of the mighty. My inbox flooded with messages from clients, some sympathetic, others curt and formal. The investigation, led by an outside agency that knew neither me nor our company's history, moved with ruthless efficiency. They combed through my emails, banking records, even my personal computer. The evidence was damning. Wire transfers authorized by my credentials, contracts approved with my signature. Of course, I hadn't authorized any of it, but every forged document, every clever manipulation, bore my digital fingerprint. The technological irony was bitter. I had designed many of those verification systems myself, never imagining they would be used against me. Rumors spread through our professional circles, bleeding from LinkedIn to industry forums and local press. Suddenly, I was the cautionary tale, my name synonymous with scandal. I received curt, impersonal letters from our biggest clients, severing ties. A few close friends reached out, voicing quiet disbelief or offering vague words of comfort. But most people fell silent, their uncertainty loud and wounding. There were nights in those weeks where I barely slept. Sleep brought only tangled dreams, replaying the moment David and Michael confronted me. Those two faces I'd trusted most, recast as strangers. Morning light brought no comfort. The house that once echoed with laughter and late-night brainstorming felt alien, each room a monument to a life dismantled. I replayed every conversation, every small misstep, desperate to pinpoint the moment everything shifted. The burden of shame was suffocating, especially on the rare occasions I glimpsed my own story, covered in the local news, the headlines clinical and devastating. But the worst cruelty was not the public disgrace, nor the financial loss. It was the private betrayal. I had loved David for more than 2 decades. We'd dreamed, fought, and built side by side. Michael was the brother I'd chosen, my anchor on the stormiest days. To imagine them not only turning against me, but conspiring together, in secret, for months, perhaps years, left a hollow ache deeper than any wound I'd known. The loss of trust was like grieving the dead, except what I mourned was still there, walking and breathing and occupying space in the world. In the aftermath, there were mornings when I lingered under the covers, paralyzed by the weight of humiliation, wondering if this was the chapter that would define the rest of my life. The story of a woman who had it all and lost it to her own blindness. Some days, anger replaced grief. How dare they? How could they destroy everything we'd made simply to secure their own success? Or worse, because they believed I stood in their way. Slowly, I learned that the path through betrayal is not linear. There were moments of resolve, drafting rebuttals to the board, sending emails to former colleagues explaining my side of the story, meeting hopelessly with lawyers who told me, gently, that absent new evidence, my options were limited. There were moments of self-doubt that gnawed at me. Was I truly as naive as they'd made me feel? Had success blinded me to warning signs? And always the suffocating loneliness of exile. My professional identity erased, my friendships shaken or lost. In those darkest days, I learned, painfully, what it means to be truly alone, to inhabit a silence so total it becomes another presence in the house. But in that silence, a different inner voice began to whisper. Not the one asking, "Why me?" but the quieter, steadier one that wondered, "What now?" I realized that while they had stolen my reputation, they could not erase my knowledge, my connections, my resilience. Beneath the devastation smoldered a spark of something fierce and unbreakable, a determination to reclaim, to uncover the truth, to heal and perhaps, someday, forgive. It would take months for that spark to burn into action. But even as winter rain lashed the windows and headlines faded, the truth dug deeper, undeterred by the wreckage left behind. I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that this was not the end of my story. Yes, the shadow of betrayal had fallen over everything I loved, but the darkness was not absolute. Somewhere, the promise of justice and renewal waited for me to rise. The lonely days. Sometimes there are stretches in a human life that pass not in days or weeks, but in some slow, heavy measure of the soul. A time when each moment feels unbearably long, as if one were walking through water with weights tied to the ankles. My months in isolation were just like that. I often think of them as a kind of waking winter, a sunless period where the world seemed as hibernate as my own heart. The initial shock of betrayal, being ousted from the company, painted as a criminal, abandoned by the 2 people I loved most, transformed into something colder and more persistent. Denial and disbelief slowly gave way to numbness. Then later, to a biting pain that, at times, turned physical. Friends and colleagues disappeared as if I'd never existed. There's a peculiar anguish to seeing your own contacts list and realizing not one number is safe to dial, either from shame or from dread of what the voice on the other end might say. The silence of the house. I spent those first weeks confined mostly indoors, too exhausted, embarrassed, and ultimately too afraid to face the world. I'd wake long before dawn, out of habit, expecting some crisis at work, some urgent client email. Instead, quiet pressed in from every wall. The home that David and I had chosen together decorated with mementos from happy years, family ski trips, bronze 5th anniversary, art from the local market, became a hollow echo chamber. Every room reminded me of what I'd lost. The kitchen felt the emptiest. I couldn't even sit at the dining table, where so many family meetings had taken place, where laughter and company and warmth had once lived. Sometimes I'd linger by the window, coffee cradled in both hands, watching neighborhood kids run to catch the bus. Life outside seemed so distant, each movement an accusation. See how effortlessly the world moves on without you. Memories as tormentors. I was haunted by memories of late-night hackathons in the office, impromptu midnight dinners with Michael's family, the pride on David's face when we'd signed our first major deal. Each memory would start gentle, then turn, stabbing me anew with the awareness that all of it had ended, and worse, ended in such betrayal. Sometimes I felt nostalgia, clear as a bell. Sometimes it soured into bitterness or anger, and I'd find myself muttering into the silence, rehearsing arguments I'd never get to have. Despite, or maybe because of, the hurt, it was impossible not to revisit everything in my mind. Was there a moment I could have acted differently? A conversation I should have heard? A ledger I should have reviewed more closely? The replay became almost compulsive. Each night, I turned over every scrap of evidence, searching for some logic in the chaos, some sign that could have warned me. Isolation in the digital age. Very quickly, I discovered that, in the internet age, silence is never complete. My story spread, first as whispered rumor across industry forums, then creeping into business newsletters, and finally, more publicly, on social media and local news. I got texts from old acquaintances masked as concern, emails stuffed with tabloid articles and faux sympathetic links. Each one was a tiny barb, a reminder of my ruined reputation and of just how interested people were in my downfall. Eventually, I stopped opening emails, let the phone battery die, and found myself voluntarily slipping into a kind of hermitage. The digital world, so essential to my career, once a measure of my own success, now became a minefield. Even the simplest online task, like scrolling through LinkedIn, risked an ambush of harsh headlines, former colleagues' cold stares, or cruel, anonymous speculation. Losing and redefining friendships. Some friends, once so close, vanished entirely. Others kept their distance, kindness edged with caution, as if my supposed crimes might be contagious. A couple of old girlfriends sent brief, awkward texts. Heard what happened. If you need anything, let me know. But no one really did call or visit. My parents, by now retired and living on the Oregon coast, tried to rally, but after years of being proud of their successful, fearless daughter, I could hear confusion and quiet heartbreak lacing every call. I found myself lying to them, assuring them I was fine, that things were working themselves out. The truth was too heavy, harder to share than my own solitude. The only true companionship in those endless days came from Coco, my aging golden retriever. She became my shadow, padding softly from room to room, nose nudging against my palm, whenever my breathing slipped from steady to ragged. Her simple, animal empathy did what no human words could. The assault on self-identity. It wasn't just my reputation on the line. It was an assault on my very self. For years, I'd defined myself by my relentless work ethic, my leadership, my ability to build something meaningful from scratch. Early mornings and late nights were part of the identity I wore proudly, the sense that I was irreplaceable at my company. When all of that was stripped away, when the network, the office, even the version of myself in David's eyes disappeared, I was left clutching little more than my own uncertainty. Some days, it was tempting to surrender to that sense of nullity. I sat in pajamas till dusk, binge-watching cooking shows just to fill the silence, eating little or sometimes too much. Housework became simultaneously too much and not enough. I'd scrub the sink twice just for the distraction, then let dishes pile up for days, lost in self-neglect. Even basic self-care felt foreign. Why shower if there's nowhere to go? My sense of time collapsed. I lost track of weekdays and weekends, living only by the rhythm of my moods and Coco's schedule. Sometimes, I found myself standing at the window, coffee long gone cold in my hand, staring without really seeing, as minutes dragged into afternoon. Guilt, shame, and the need for answers. Another undercurrent was shame, the paralyzing kind that cuts deeper than anger, manifesting as self-doubt so profound, it swallows even the idea of fighting back. I replayed every conversation with Michael and David in my mind, scrutinizing my trusting laughter or the easy sharing of confidential details. Was I naive, blind, arrogant? Some instinctively helpful part of me tried to explain away their actions as desperation or misunderstanding. But mostly, I was furious with myself for missing the signs. At times, anger won out, volcanic and hot, prompting me to pace the hallway and punch fists into the couch cushions. How dare they? How could betrayal be so calculated, so coordinated? Didn't 20 years together count for anything, even a warning? But at my lowest, the anger faded, replaced by helpless resignation. I wondered if maybe I'd truly brought it on myself. Maybe I really was expendable, as replaceable as the headline said. Searching for meaning and building daily rituals. With so much emptiness, I needed small rituals. Anything to give my days some structure. I forced myself to make the bed each morning, to walk Coco around the block, to prepare a real breakfast at least once a week. I took up journaling, though most entries started and ended with the same question. Some days, I found this discipline soothing. Other days, it felt pointless. But the rituals worked, just enough to pull me through, day after day, week after week. What now? I started reading again. Nothing as technical or taxing as my old work, but memoirs of women who'd weathered storms, fiction set in distant cities, books of poetry that handled pain with delicate hands. Facing the neighborhood, eventually, necessities forced me back into the world. Groceries, pharmacy runs, the bank. Everything outside had the tinge of estrangement. I suspected the cashier at the store of recognizing me from the news, or imagined strangers whispering behind me in line. Whether or not it actually happened was irrelevant. The shame colored all my encounters. I spoke less, kept my head down, developed a stoic, neutral smile. Still, there were moments of grace. A neighbor who waved from across the street, an elderly man who complimented Coco's patience, even a cashier who met my eyes with such compassion that I found myself blinking back tears. These were fleeting, but each reminder of basic decency nursed a tiny spark of hope. Enduring legal proceedings and mounting pressure. The legal battle began quietly, as a series of emails, informal documents, but then grew into a relentless thrum. My lawyer, a pragmatic, sharp-witted woman named Sharon, explained the process in dispassionate, almost surgical terms. Evidence would be needed. Patience was required. Victories would not come quickly or without risk. I spent hours gathering what I could. Emails, old notebooks, fragments of digital history that might prove my innocence. The process was glacial and humiliating. The company's attorneys drilled me with questions, twisting my every word. Friends and staff were deposed. Some, unsure or scared, echoed whatever official narrative came from the company. I watched them on video calls, faces familiar, voices stilted, careful not to meet my gaze. It hurt, but strangely, I could not find it in me to blame them. Fear does strange things to people. The slow rekindling of resolve. It's funny how, when everything is taken from you, even the prospect of justice feels like a thread too thin to grasp. At first, I only wanted vindication, a reversal of shame, a restoration of my old life. But slowly, as the months wore on, something subtly changed. I began to see my struggle not as a quest to return to the past, but as the slow forming of a new self, one constructed in adversity, determined not to let betrayal be my legacy. Daily, almost imperceptibly, resolve returned. I reconnected with two old clients, both women, who admitted they'd silently doubted my guilt. One offered a reference, the other a cup of coffee, and 2 hours of fierce, unfiltered sympathy. I started volunteering at a food bank, at first to fill time, but quickly began to realize the restorative power of helping someone else, however briefly. I sought counseling, and over the course of many raw sessions, began to unravel the knots of self-doubt and humiliation that had tethered me. My therapist, a patient, unflappable man named Greg, helped me see the betrayal as something done, glimmers of hope. Eventually, new friends began to appear, not from my old life, but from these small acts of living. The food bank connected me with a group of local women, some single mothers, some retired professionals, all armed with humor and hard-won wisdom. Their perspective and companionship reminded me not only that I could still connect, but that there was a life outside of headlines and loss. I realized slowly that this chapter, however wrenching, would one day fit into a whole story, a story of not just destruction, but also rebirth. The loneliness didn't end, but it became less absolute. In fact, I came to understand that loneliness, at its worst, is also the birthplace of resilience. As spring replaced that long winter, I began, tentatively, to imagine a future for myself, not defined by what I'd suffered, or even by what I would win back, but by the person I was learning to become. Turning the game around. No one tells you what to do when your whole world is burned to the ground by the people you trusted most. I'd spent months drifting in a life that barely resembled my own. My days reduced to rituals of survival, but somewhere in the middle of all that loss, a quiet morning, the metallic taste of resolve replacing bitterness, I realized that grief and anger were only the beginning. What came next would be up to me. For weeks, maybe months, the only question I could muster was planting the first seeds. My first step was one I delayed for too long: truth-telling. Not to the world, not yet, to myself. I sat in my living room, pen and legal pad in hand, and began the painful process of untangling the past year. I wrote everything I could remember, the little oddities, the red flags I'd brushed away, the meetings that never happened, the looks I tried to forget. At first, these notes were little more than a confession, a way to order chaos and ease guilt. But as the days passed and the list grew, a pattern began to emerge, and with it, a plan. The next task was harder still. I had to reopen lines of communication, even when all my instincts screamed to stay hidden. With trembling hands, I reached out to anyone who might listen. Former colleagues, loyal clients, and even staff who had quietly left Parker Solutions in the aftermath of my ousting. Some of them, wary at first, agreed to short phone calls or coffee meetings in anonymous spots across Seattle. I asked questions, listened more than I spoke. What had they heard? What had they seen in the office during those final months? Patterns and cracks began to show through their stories. Many remembered moments that, in retrospect, seemed suspicious. Michael's tense, late-night visits to the office, David's unexplained absences, directives that bypassed normal channels. Digging through the evidence, collecting these scraps of information, took patience greater than I thought myself capable of. More than once, I hesitated. Was I fooling myself? What if they're really? But I pressed on. I requested copies of company records through my attorney, citing my legal right to certain information as a founder and shareholder. The process was grueling. Every document arrived heavily redacted, some files missing, others strangely incomplete. My lawyer, Sharon, was a lifeline throughout, reminding me of procedure and, on my darkest days, of my own sanity. During long, quiet nights, I pored over hundreds of pages, bank statements with strange transfers, invoice numbers that didn't line up, emails sent from my account during times I could prove I wasn't even at my desk or in the city. I grew methodical, color-coding data, building timelines with sticky notes across my dining room wall. There, beneath the weight of so much paper, the machinery of their deception came into focus. Most chilling were the little details. The misuse of my digital signature, expertly timed wire transfers when no one else was around. I knew our systems better than anyone, and I saw traces of forced entries and unauthorized logins camouflaged by Michael's so-called upgrades. It was horrifying and oddly vindicating. This was not a crime of passion or confusion. It was a conspiracy, deliberate and cruel. Was evidence against me? What if I was simply chasing ghosts, desperate for any narrative but the one that branded me a criminal? Rallying old allies. As my case built itself, another battle played out. The slow reopening of relationships I thought were lost to me. Some people, when I met them, offered apologies. They had believed the headlines, or, more often, had been too afraid to question them. Parker Solutions was their paycheck, and being seen talking to me could end that security. It was a hard truth, but also, strangely, a relief. Not all doors were shut from malice, but from fear. Others were willing to speak up, especially as I shared some of my findings. A few remembered odd instructions from Michael, the rushed projects, contracts requiring urgent signature with no time for review. One web developer, Max, quietly gave me his logs from company databases. He'd kept them, just in case, he said, fearful of the way things had started to smell rotten, even before I was gone. It was Max who first dared to put his name in writing, recording a statement for Sharon about discrepancies he had seen. He wasn't the only one. An old client, Julia, confirmed in an affidavit that she'd been pressured by David and Michael to rewrite the timeline of a major payment. Little by little, what had been a whisper grew into a chorus. Reclaiming my own story. Word spread, not publicly, but privately, through a network of those who refused to believe the worst, or who recognized, finally, the stench of injustice. Through all of this, I felt my sense of self reforming, like a muscle I'd nearly forgotten how to flex. I had to tell my truth, but also own my mistakes. I began to see that my willingness to trust blindly, to value harmony over hard questions, had created openings for David and Michael to act. Therapy, which once had felt like salt in a wound, now became a refining fire. Greg, my therapist, guided me in transforming helpless anger into focus. My anger could be fuel, but I'd have to use it smartly, not destructively. I spent hours rehearsing what I would one day say to a judge, to the shareholders, to the world. A calculated counteroffensive. With evidence, witness statements, and a growing sense of purpose, Sharon and I began to strategize. We filed a civil suit contesting the official findings of my removal and adding a counterclaim for damages relating to fraudulent activity and defamation. Official court business moved slower than molasses, but each deadline met, each filing completed, was another brick in the fortress I was rebuilding. We also started working with a digital forensics expert, one of my former interns, now an independent consultant. Daniel was eager to help, combing through recovered hard drives and archived emails. He traced patterns of IP address changes, the manipulation of approval protocols, and found embedded timestamps disproving the company's official version of events. The legal process was, at times, soul-crushing. David's lawyers, expensive, relentless, pushed back at every turn. There were depositions where they tried to rattle me, paint me as overconfident, erratic, or bitter. But with every attempt, I grew savvier. I learned to answer only the question, to let silence settle, to trust my own record. Network of quiet support. In those months, I encountered surprising allies. My volunteer work at the food bank had introduced me to Gloria, a retired businesswoman who became both friend and mentor. She'd weathered her own storms and taught me the value of dignity in the face of disgrace. Don't surrender the story of your life to someone else's pen, she told me one afternoon over tea. It's your name. Take it back. Some evenings, the women at the food bank would bring over dinner, coaxing me into laughter with stories of their own resilience. The humility of those moments, sharing a casserole, folding grocery bags with near strangers, stripped away the last, stubborn bits of self-pity. I realized that if I could survive tarnished in the public eye, I could survive anything. Redrawing boundaries, reclaiming agency. These new relationships required vulnerability. I allowed myself, for the first time in years, to talk about ambition, disappointment, and the cost of being a public woman in tech. The vulnerability was liberating, forging bonds that were honest and unburdened by the expectations of my old world. At home, new routines anchored me. I found small ways to reclaim my space, painting the walls of the den, planting lavender under the window, giving away suits and heels that no longer felt like mine. Coco, ever faithful, became the unwitting confidant for many a late-night strategy session. I also began to mentor young women in tech again, offering virtual workshops on cybersecurity and professional resilience. Their enthusiasm, their hunger for growth, inspired me and reminded me of the zeal that had set me on this path. Their questions forced me to remember what I had to offer and what I still had to fight for. The gathering storm months became seasons, and my case, once a faint hope, grew into a coordinated offensive. By summer, the evidence we held was enough for Sharon to request a formal hearing. That meant facing David and Michael in a preliminary courtroom, no longer as their former friend and wife, but as their challenger, armed with data, witnesses, and the conviction they had never anticipated. I spent sleepless nights preparing. I drafted my opening statement 100 times, reading it aloud until the words felt like armor. Sharon and I reviewed every document, anticipated every argument, built timelines and strategies for cross-examination. The day before our hearing, I walked the shoreline near my home with Coco. Watching the cold blue waves, I allowed myself a moment of fear, of anticipation, of pride. I still felt the scars of what they had done, but now I could see beyond them, to the possibility of justice, and more importantly, of self-respect restored. A new strength, hard-won. Turning the game around wasn't a single act of bravado, nor was it ever certain to succeed. It was daily, sometimes hourly. A choice not to give up, to believe that truth, proven and persistent, has power. I understood, better than ever, the difference between naive trust and earned faith. I no longer placed my future in other people's hands. I shaped it with my own. Yet the closer I drew to my day in court, the less the outcome meant in the grand scheme. Yes, I hungered for vindication, for my name to be cleared, for assets restored. But something more fundamental had shifted. I had reclaimed my agency, my voice, the right to tell my own story. Whatever came next, verdict, settlement, public opinion, I would meet it with full knowledge of who I was and what it cost to rebuild. The woman walking into that courtroom was not the one who'd been destroyed a year before. She was stronger, sharper, and determined not simply to survive, but to win. Justice in the spotlight. When you've been at the center of a quiet storm for so long, you forget what noise truly means. For months, my life had played out in hushed tones. Law offices, closed-door meetings, and midnight strategy sessions over takeout. Always mindful not to disturb the fragile hope I was nursing. But nothing could have prepared me for the blaze of attention that came with my day in court. Justice, I would learn, isn't just a matter of facts and evidence. It's theater, and suddenly, I was cast as both the accused and the protagonist in a drama staged for the whole city to see. The trial was scheduled for the first week of May. By then, word had spread. A founder's fall from grace, a sensational countersuit, allegations of fraud that reached right into the engine room of Parker Solutions. The local news seized on every leak and rumor. Talk radio stations debated my innocence. Former employees speculated online, torn between outrage and schadenfreude. Sometimes I watched the news segments from my living room, jaw clenched, watching as a parade of experts I'd never met dissected the company, my marriage, and, more painfully, my own personality. When I finally walked into the courthouse, everything felt both surreal and hyperreal. Cameramen jostled for position out front, their shouts ricocheting off the stone steps. Friends had warned me to keep my head down, but I held it as high as I could, more for myself than for the crowd, repeating silently, the courtroom, as arena inside. The courtroom was packed. I recognized faces from my past, old co-workers, former mentors, even a high school teacher I hadn't seen in decades. Across the aisle sat David and Michael, each with a team of lawyers. I felt their eyes on me, cold and appraising. The judge was a dignified woman with a reputation for sharp intelligence and sharper patience. I prayed she'd see through the layers of performance that always seep into public trials. The prosecution presented their case first, methodical but mechanical. They highlighted every piece of supposedly damning evidence: time transfers, forged contracts, email trails that painted me as a master manipulator. For each accusation, their tone was cool, their slides rehearsed. There were moments when the weight of their narrative threatened to pull me under. A shot of my digital signature, hysterical headlines snapped on screen, sales charts slumping after my fall from grace. It was as if every mistake or oversight any founder had ever made was being heaped onto my shoulders, grist for their mill. But when Sharon stood, I saw the tide begin to shift. She wove entire timelines from the fragments I'd collected, showing how records had changed, how certain transactions had been engineered to appear at times I was provably absent, how access logs disproved the official story. Daniel, our young digital forensics expert, calmly guided the jury through the digital maze, tracing the fingerprints Michael and David had left behind, like breadcrumbs. For the first time, I saw some of the jury members lean forward, eyebrows raised, the preordained script starting to unravel at the edges, facing my accusers. The most grueling moment, by far, was facing David and Michael in open court. The silent accusations in their eyes replaced by carefully worded testimony. David's answers were clipped, almost robotic. Only occasionally did I catch a glint of remorse or recognition. Did he remember our late-night planning, the vows we'd exchanged, the risks we'd taken together? Michael avoided my eyes entirely. He stuck to the narrative, denying knowledge, pushing blame wherever he thought it would stick. My turn on the stand was both terrifying and liberating. The questions came rapid fire, about trust, about money, about moments I'd agonized over for more than a year. But as I answered, I felt a clarity I hadn't known I possessed. I spoke not just for vindication, but for the company we'd built, the employees misled, the truth obstructed by fear and ambition. I acknowledged my flaws: too much trust, not enough suspicion, a tendency to believe the best in people. That admission seemed to matter. I saw it, I think, in the judge's steady gaze, and in the notes the jury scribbled, as though they might understand not only what had happened, but who I really was beneath the headlines. The evidence unveiled. The most dramatic moment came late in the week, when Sharon introduced a chain of newly discovered emails, verified by Daniel, that showed the original author metadata, documents transferred between David and Michael, time-stamped at hours I was traveling, proof that my credentials had been cloned and misused. Even the judge paused, scrolling back and forth over the emails, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. A hush fell over the court as Max, the quiet web developer, testified. His logs and recollections matched the timeline perfectly, tying Michael to late-night server changes and unexplained database edits. Julia, my old client, described the pressure she'd been under to rewrite invoices retroactively, her hands trembling only once as Sharon reassured her with a gentle nod. Piece by piece, the facade crumbled. David's lawyer objected, cajoled, tried to cast doubt, but the weight of the evidence was relentless. I sat rigid, heart hammering, as the narrative was redrawn in public view. Not the story of a greedy founder blinded by ambition, but of a partner betrayed, a system exploited, and a reputation nearly destroyed. Verdict and aftermath. The deliberation lasted less than a day. The city held its breath, so did I. When the bailiff summoned us back to court, I saw the same faces in the gallery, eyes wide and hungry, for vindication or spectacle. I couldn't tell which. The judge looked directly at me as she began to read out the verdict. Not guilty, exonerated of all charges. David and Michael found culpable for fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty. A sound escaped me, half sob, half laugh. So primal, I almost didn't recognize it as my own. Sharon squeezed my hand. Gloria, my friend from the food bank, dabbed at her eyes in the gallery. For the first time in years, the tears I wept were not out of fear or shame, but an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. Cameras flashed as we left the building. Reporters pressed microphones forward, each shouting some version of, "How do you feel?" All I could think to answer was the truth. I'm proud to have cleared my name, and I am grateful for the chance to start again. The true price and meaning of justice. Justice in the spotlight is noisy, messy, and always incomplete. It doesn't heal every wound or restore every loss. In many ways, victory was bittersweet. Years could not be reclaimed, nor relationships rebuilt overnight. But I walked away with something even more lasting than public vindication. The knowledge that I could stand in the white-hot glare of accusation, tell my story, and survive. In that glare, I found not just justice, but a hard, bright kind of hope. The hope that comes from seeing your truth made visible, even when the whole world is watching. Rebirth and new aspirations. Exoneration felt in those first few days, both like an end and a bewildering new beginning. The weight that had pressed on my chest for so long was suddenly gone, replaced by an echoing emptiness and the faintest possibility of hope. I was free, yes, but free for what? After years of building, losing, fighting, and defending, I woke up to a stillness I'd almost forgotten. The sense, rare in adulthood, that anything might be possible again. The process of reclaiming my life was hardly dramatic. There was no triumphant music, no montage of victories, just an almost invisible turning toward the future. It began with mundane things. I cleaned out closets still stuffed with memories and the detritus of my old life. I recycled boxes of outdated hardware and donated stacks of business suits I no longer wanted to wear. I painted a wall a shade of sky that, months earlier, I would have considered too bright. These small acts were my way of telling myself, the past is over, and you don't owe it your allegiance. Rediscovering my identity. For so long, my sense of self had been wound up with Parker Solutions, with its triumphs, and eventually with its catastrophe. Once the verdict was in, and my name was officially cleared, I realized just how much I associated my worth and identity with my professional accomplishments. The world, or at least my corner of it, had deferred to me when I was a CEO. But now I was no one's boss. I was simply Elizabeth, a woman relieved of her burdens and left, for the first time in decades, to ask herself what she wanted. I started with what I'd missed and what I'd lost. Music, for example. I retrieved my old guitar from the basement, wiped off the dust, and strummed clumsy chords that blunted my anxiety. I made time each week to walk new neighborhoods, discovering tiny coffee shops and quiet corners of the city that I never had time for in my old life. I reconnected with my parents on the coast, letting them see my struggle and healing without the filter of pride or performance. More than once, I cried over the losses, the irrevocable ones. There were friendships that hadn't survived, opportunities gone forever, and days I would never get back. Forgiveness of David, of Michael, but mostly of myself, became a daily task, and sometimes I failed at it. But in forgiving, I recognize that grief is not the opposite of beginning again. Rather, it is the soil in which renewal takes root. A new mission, Parker Revival. One truth became clear. I could never, and would never want to, simply slip back into my old life, or into any traditional mold. I needed to build something that mattered, but differently than before. That's how Parker Revival was born. The name was deliberate, a nod not just to my own renewal, but to the notion that every dream, bruised or broken, can be tended and remade. I wanted Parker Revival to be something bigger than just another business. I envisioned it as a boutique consultancy and resource hub for women, especially those who, like me, had weathered betrayal or workplace injustice and were struggling to rebuild. It began with late-night plans at my kitchen table, cocoa curled at my feet, my notebook open, possibilities spilling out. My first idea was to create practical workshops and mentorship programs, how to navigate workplace politics, digital security basics for small business owners, confidence coaching, and financial literacy. I reached out, carefully, quietly, to women I'd met at the food bank, to friends of friends who'd faced legal or professional hardship, to survivors of fraud, divorce, and discrimination. Most were skeptical at first. I understood. I'd grown wary myself. But slowly, the network formed. We met in borrowed meeting rooms or over video calls. We shared stories that weren't built on LinkedIn highlights, but on stumbles and survival. I watched, week by week, as women who'd been silenced by shame or loneliness rediscovered their voices. Empowerment through community. Parker Revival thrived because I ran it with the old fire of ambition, but because I learned to nurture rather than drive. I saw my role as a connector, a listener, and a builder of structures that would outlast my own direct involvement. My scars made me more patient. I recognized uncertainty in others because I still carried it myself. A few months in, we partnered with legal advocates willing to offer pro bono advice to women facing workplace retaliation. We secured modest grants for technology training, basic coding, cybersecurity, web design, so no member would be locked out of digital opportunity. I helped craft policies for local women's co-ops, lending my tech background to ensure they operated securely and efficiently. What amazed me most was the ripple effect. Our meetings filled with laughter and hard truths in equal measure. In one session, a working mother confessed that for the first time since her wrongful termination, she could picture going back to work. Another woman, whose startup had been undermined by a partner's theft, told us she'd been interviewing investors with newfound assurance. We didn't heal each other's wounds, not exactly, but together, we learned how to live with our scars and even see them as proof of resilience, personal growth, and letting go. Professionally, I felt reborn. Personally, I struggled as much as I flourished. Old fears surfaced. Would the world always see me as the woman at the center of that scandal? Could I ever trust my own judgment when it came to people? Therapy remained my groundwork, as did writing. I kept my journals faithfully, not just as a record of pain, but as a log of growth. I wrote letters I never sent, to David, to Michael, even to former colleagues who'd chosen silence. Each letter was less about them and more about unspooling the parts inside me that still craved justice or explanation. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past, but about reclaiming my own narrative from its shadow. Slowly, I took back my space, physically and mentally. I repainted my bedroom, purged phone contacts that brought only anxiety, and found strength in new beginnings. I turned off Google alerts for my name. I limited the news. I learned that peace sometimes means choosing what new relationships and restored family ties. As months passed, the loneliness that had once felt absolute softened into solitude, something I could manage, sometimes even savor. I made new friends, many from Parker Revival, but also neighbors, volunteers, the owner of the coffee shop where I worked on my laptop. The connections were different. There was less performance, more honesty, more room to say, "I don't know," or "You too." Eventually, as time widened, my family became a source of renewal, not just consolation. My parents' faith in me, untarnished even when the world doubted, remained my bedrock. I reconnected with cousins, spent holidays on the Oregon coast, and even took my parents on a long-promised trip to Vancouver. My children, grown and steady, confided in me more than they had when I was consumed by work. They saw the toll that pain had taken, but also the way I had rebuilt, and they told me, sometimes in small ways, that they were proud. Romance after wreckage. Of all the changes, reopening my heart was the slowest and least predictable. For a long time, I wasn't sure I wanted, or even could, offer trust to another partner. I read about others who'd fallen in love again after betrayal and found it hard to believe. Yet, healing rarely follows a logical path. Months after my exoneration, I met someone at a cybersecurity conference, an old acquaintance of a friend, with a calm confidence and a disarming willingness to let silence linger. Our courtship, if you can call it that, was not marked by fireworks or declarations, but by gentleness. He asked questions, listened, and accepted the complicated history that came with loving me. For the first time, I judged not by charisma or ambition, but by character, consistency, kindness. I don't know what the future holds. I no longer measure my life by guarantees or long-term forecasts, but even the possibility of loving again, tentative, fragile as it is, feels like a gift, a true sign of rebirth. Looking to the horizon, if there's a single lesson I've taken from everything, it's that the past may shape you, but you get to shape what comes next. My ambitions have evolved. My life is smaller in some ways, yet infinitely larger in meaning. I spend more time giving than competing, more time listening than asserting my place. I still run Parker Revival, but I know that empowerment is a gift to be shared, not a throne to sit upon. I invest as much in my inner world as I do in external accomplishment. I read widely, play music, travel when I can, and offer my experience openly, even, maybe especially, when it means admitting vulnerability. I walk Coco every morning, rain or shine, letting the rhythm of her footsteps remind me that dawn always comes. Most days, I feel more alive, more hopeful, more myself than I did before disaster struck. On hard days, I remember the worst times, and I realize that survival was just the start. Thriving, however you define it, is the true victory, the light beyond the shadows. The world hasn't become a kinder place. Injustice still prowls corners, both visible and unseen. But I have learned that speaking truth, building community, and refusing to let betrayal define you are acts of quiet revolution. I wish I could promise comfort to every woman who sits, as I once did, in the ruins of trust. I can't, but I can offer my story, flawed and hopeful, as proof that darkness, no matter how consuming, is never the end. In the end, we don't choose the shadows that fall across our path, but we do choose whether to kindle a light and walk on. For me, the light is built from community, renewed purpose, and the fierce determination to turn pain into promise. As I move forward, I carry the past as part of me, but not the sum of me. My ambitions are new, my heart, once battered, beats with hope, and my life, resurrected from the ashes, is once again my own.